Good evening, and welcome to the American Experience. I'm David McCullough. One of the great things about growing up in Pittsburgh, as I did, was the wonderful Carnegie Library, the Carnegie Library of all Carnegie libraries. But there was also the Carnegie Music Hall next door, and the Carnegie Museum, where, awestruck as a kid, I saw my first ever dinosaur, a colossus of reconstructed bones labeled, if you can believe it, Diplodocus carnegii. Andrew Carnegie wasn't a name in a history book. He was part of life in Pittsburgh, Carnegie and steel. And though nobody in my family was a steel worker or directly involved in the steel business, we knew, as everybody did, that steel was what made all the wheels go in Pittsburgh. Steel was the backbone of modern civilization, my father liked to explain at the dinner table. A great country was a country that made things, and Pittsburgh, he would say proudly, made steel. But I also remember my father once remarking to my surprise that Andrew Carnegie was a mean little devil. The film that follows is one I'm particularly pleased to introduce because of my Pittsburgh roots, but also because it shows what real drama history is made of. It's all here. The rise of industrial power such as the world had never seen, wealth of almost unimaginable proportions, science and technology and cutthroat competition transforming the way America lived and worked. There is friendship, betrayal, the clash of labor and management, the bloody Homestead strike, the tensions within Andrew Carnegie himself, the good and the bad and the painful, and the promise of progress. Here is part of our experience as a nation too little understood and of greatest importance, when the America we know came into being. The Richest Man in the World, Andrew Carnegie, by producer Austin Hoyt.
For 700 years, Scottish bishops and lords had reigned over Skibo Castle. In 1899, it passed to an American who had fled Scotland penniless. To Andrew Carnegie, Skibo was heaven on earth. If heaven is more beautiful than this, he joked, someone has made a mistake. When Carnegie left Scotland at age 12, he was living with his family in one cramped room. He returned to 40,000 acres, and he wasn't yet the richest man in the world. Andrew Carnegie's life seemed touched by magic.
Carnegie was more than most people. Not only more wealthy, not only more optimistic. In his case, it goes almost to the point of unreality. Carnegie is still right throughout his life the little boy in the fairy story for whom everything has to be all right.
Carnegie was a legendary figure in his own time, a 19th century icon. He embodied the American dream, the immigrant who made it from rags to riches, whose schoolhouse was the library. The democratic American whose house guests included Mark Twain, Booker T. Washington, Helen Keller, Rockefellers and royalty, and the ordinary folks from his childhood. He would entertain them all together. Although he loved Scotland, he prized America as a land free from Britain's monarchy and inherited privilege. After King Edward VII visited Skibo, Carnegie told a friend, "All Americans are kings." But everyone knew there was only one king of steel.
He set out literally to conquer the world of steel, and that he did, and became the largest steel producer not only in the United States, but Carnegie Steel by 1900 produced more steel than the entire steel industry of Great Britain.
Carnegie was fond of saying, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." He made his fortune and then, unlike any industrialist of his time, began systematically to give it away. He was most famous as a benefactor of libraries, almost 3,000 around the world. He gave millions to support education, a pension plan for teachers, and the cause of world peace. Carnegie wrote of the obligations of the wealthy, how they should return their money to the societies where they made it.
Then, almost inadvertently, Carnegie, as a kind of aside, tosses in a very revealing sentence. He wrote, and besides, it provides a refuge from self-questioning. In other words, this old internal and eternal torment was still going on. Maybe with the giving away of his money, he would justify what he had done to get that money.
Carnegie presided over one of the darkest chapters in American labor history. He always saw himself as a friend of the working man. But the lives of his workers were not fairy tales, where everything turns out all right.
By the standards of his time, he was less ruthless than many of his contemporaries. But certainly by the standards of ethics and conduct to which we would like to hold businessmen today, he indeed operated extremely ruthlessly.
That was not how Carnegie's daughter Margaret remembered her father, at least in public.
My father was a kindly, friendly man. He always wanted to be remembered as one who loved his fellow men. He was a great optimist, incurably so. All is well since all goes better. That was his motto. He lived by it and believed in it firmly.
The private thoughts of Carnegie's daughter were harsher. Tell his life like it was, she urged her father's biographer. I'm sick of the Santa Claus stuff. Carnegie was born in Dunfermline, the medieval capital of Scotland, in 1835. The town prospered as the center of a growing linen industry. Its highly skilled weavers were considered the aristocrats of craftsmen, though not the equal of shopkeepers on the high street. Carnegie could remember the time before the Industrial Revolution forced the weavers from their homes and forged the course of his life. Young Andrew fully expected to be a weaver like his father Will. He lived in a humble cottage at the foot of town, down the hill from the high street. His father kept his hand looms at home. When Andrew was a little boy, Will's linens were in demand, and he owned 4 looms. Andrew would sit at his father's feet, mesmerized by the rhythmic sounds of the shuttle and the foot pedals. But the Industrial Revolution changed that. The steam-powered looms that came to Dunfermline in 1847 put hundreds of handloom weavers out of work. As Will Carnegie began to sell his looms one by one, Andrew's mother, Margaret, held the family together.
She opened a small shop in the front room of their cottage, where she kept a kind of grocer's shop, and she worked all the hours that God gave her mending shoes in order to keep the family in food, in respectability, and in clean collars, which was very important to her.
She wants to achieve affluence, and she wants to be regarded as the equal of anyone she chooses. And the dwindling of the family income bit by bit as the Industrial Revolution ate up the Carnegie sources of income, and the selling of the bases of their wealth was a business of slow growing shame for Margaret Carnegie. The boy would have been extremely conscious of this.
Andrew would feel the pressure of his mother's shame, as well as the preference she showed his younger brother Tom. The boys lived in one room with their mother and father. Margaret provided for them in that bitter winter of 1848, when hundreds of their neighbors went to bed early to forget the misery of hunger. I began to learn what poverty meant, Andrew would later write. Dreadful days came when my father took the last of his webs to the great manufacturers, and I saw my mother anxiously awaiting his return. It was burnt into my heart then that my father had to beg for work. And then and there came the resolve that I would cure that when I got to be a man. For Andrew's mother, getting to the top meant moving up the hill to the high street, where the respectable shopkeepers lived, like George Lauder, who had married her sister. But after the disastrous winter, that was impossible. She organized the family to move, not to the high street, but to Pittsburgh, where two other sisters lived. She auctioned the household belongings. She auctioned the remaining loom, which brought almost nothing. She had to borrow the last 20 pounds for the passage to America. Like many of the nearly 190,000 who left Britain for America in 1848, the Carnegies left in shame. Andrew, aged 12, was determined that in the new world he would heal the wounds of his father's defeat in the old. When the Carnegies arrived in Pittsburgh, they found an iron manufacturing center enveloped by slimy rivers and befouled by smoke. They had fled poverty and despair in a romantic Scottish town, only to find in Pittsburgh the same poverty and despair amid squalor. They settled in a neighborhood called Slabtown, where Margaret's sister rented them 2 small rooms in her house on Rebecca Street. Like many immigrant children, Andrew, after only 5 years of schooling, went to work. At age 13, he stoked boilers in a textile factory 12 hours a day. The job gave him nightmares. He would bolt up in bed seeing the steam gauges falling too low to provide power, or rising so high he feared the boiler would explode. He could not wait to escape the world of furnaces. His chance came with an innovation that was transforming America, the first instantaneous long-distance communication. In 1849, Carnegie entered the world of what he called tamed lightning, as a messenger boy in a telegraph office, determined to get to the top.
One of the first things that he did was to memorize every street in downtown Pittsburgh. Once he had delivered a telegram to a particularly important businessman, he never forgot that face, so that when he would see that individual on the street, he would say, "Good morning, Mr. So-and-so."
It's an opportunity for him to ingratiate himself, but also He's in and out of the Pittsburgh business establishments. He's privy to the information that they're transmitting. He learns who the important people are in Pittsburgh business. He knows what kind of people they are. He learns about their credit rating. He learns about their reputations. And this is typical of his ability to seize on the moment, to seize the opportunity.
One spring evening, Andrew was downriver dispatching messages by steamboat when he met his father, headed down the Ohio to Cincinnati to sell his tablecloths.
To his surprise, he saw on deck his father with his package of hand-loom weaving, too poor even to buy an inside cabin on a cold night, and there was the stark contrast. The young boy, still in his teens, the success, his father, the failure in America. The father grabbed Andrew's hand and said in a broken voice, "Andrew, I'm proud of you." And Andrew simply took this as a compliment, not seeing the kind of despair in his father's eyes about his own failure.
After 7 years in America, Will Carnegie died at age 51, a broken man, a victim of the Industrial Revolution. Andrew's career was just beginning. He took a job on America's leading railroad, the Pennsylvania. And he found a father figure who would be the most important influence on his young adult life. Thomas A. Scott, superintendent of the railroad's Western Division.
Scott was in and out of the telegraph office all the time, and Carnegie came to his attention as a bright, young, cheerful guy. And I think Scott saw something of himself in the younger man. They'd both started off very poor and were ambitious and working their way up. And Scott began to call him my boy Andy. And when he got the chance, he hired Andrew to be his own telegrapher and assistant at the princely sum of $35 a month.
Carnegie got a $10 raise and a chance to ride the railroad. For a 17-year-old, it was irresistible. He preferred to ride with the engineer. And he adored his new boss, Tom Scott. All the hero worship that is inherent in youth, he would write, I showered upon him. With Scott's help, Carnegie began to learn the complexities of railroads, which had become America's biggest businesses.
One day he came home to find his mother weeping, which was very unusual. She was a tough, hard woman who had essentially kept the family together. He said, "Never mind, Mother, I'll take care of you, and someday we'll ride in a coach." She said, "What good would that do if the people in Dunfermline can't see us riding in a coach?" That became his goal, to be rich enough to take his mother back and for them to ride together in a coach through the streets of Dunfermline.
Soon, Andrew was able to buy a house at the edge of Pittsburgh, away from the smoke and grime. Margaret would hire a servant. While Tom finished school, Andrew was pushing ahead.
One day Scott was gone and Carnegie was in the office. A message arrived about a wreck. The line is blocked, the trains have stopped moving, and Carnegie steps in and takes charge. Though he doesn't have specific authority to do this, he assumes the authority.
Carnegie sent out the messages telling the men what to do about the wreck, get the trains moving again, signed them all TAS, Thomas A. Scott. He said to himself, "My boy, this is death or Westminster Abbey."
When Scott returned, he assessed the situation. He saw what had happened, what Carnegie had done, and he glowered at Carnegie and said nothing. And Andy feared for a time that perhaps he had done wrong, but a story got back to him that Scott had told an associate, "Let me tell you what that little white-haired Scots devil of mine did."
Faced with another wreck, Carnegie wired boldly, "Burn the cars." Scott was amazed, but burning cars became standard procedure following wrecks to cut delays and cut down costs. Carnegie worked with Scott to develop bigger cars, bigger locomotives, longer trains to carry bigger loads, all to cut costs. They were the first to keep telegraph stations open around the clock. The first to keep trains moving 24 hours a day. Carnegie learned from Scott what made the Pennsylvania Railroad a model to the world. Cut costs by running them fast and running them full. Cut costs by cutting wages, by demanding 13-hour days, by avoiding strikes like the ones the freight men called in the winter of 1856. When a worker informed Carnegie that maintenance men also threatened to strike, Carnegie gave Scott a list of those involved, whom Scott promptly fired. Young Andy would not forget the value of spies, nor Scott the value of his boy Andy. As the railroad expanded west, Scott taught Andy how they too, in an era of unregulated business, could make a profit along the tracks. Together they invested in Theodore Woodruff's new sleeping cars, which Scott bought for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Carnegie's $217 investment soon paid $5,000 a year. Woodruff shunted aside, went bankrupt. Carnegie foresaw the need for iron bridges to replace wooden ones and formed a company to make them. He held Scott's shares in his name, while Railroad President J. Edgar Thompson put his in his wife's name to avoid the perception of conflict as they bought their own iron bridges for the Pennsylvania Railroad. To make the iron for the bridges that Scott would buy for the Pennsylvania Railroad, Carnegie followed his brother Tom into the iron business. Carnegie's investments along the tracks became so profitable that a salary of $2,400 a year from the railroad represented a mere 5% of his income. In 1865, he left the Pennsylvania Railroad to pursue his other ventures. He could rejoice in the 12 years that had passed since Thomas Scott first called him "my boy Andy." Along with his mother Margaret, Andrew, still a bachelor, moved to New York. They took a suite at the St. Nicholas, New York's most fashionable hotel. Margaret could now wallow in luxury and banish the memories of immigrating in steerage, of stitching shoes by candlelight down a muddy alley in Slabtown. Her boy was now a wealthy man, but dissatisfied. At age 33, Andrew took stock of his life. He wrote himself a letter vowing to work for only 2 more years, to educate himself, and then to devote his life to benevolent purposes. Simply making more money, he wrote, must degrade me beyond hope of permanent recovery. Carnegie had moved to New York at the beginning of the Gilded Age, marked by the fortunes of an emerging industrial elite. He may have found the pursuit of wealth degrading, but to others it was a natural expression of progress. English philosopher Herbert Spencer was gaining popularity, justifying the survival of the fittest in the free market jungle. As for the poor, Spencer felt nature meant to cast them aside. Carnegie encountered these ideas in New York's literary salons as he prepared for a life of good works. Light came in as a flood, he wrote, and all was clear. He reduced 30 volumes of Spencer's writings to what became his motto, "All is well since all grows better," and the simple phrase, "upward and onward." His self-doubts seemed to vanish.
Spencer told him that it was a scientific fact that somebody like him should be getting to the top, that there was nothing unnatural about it, wrong about it, evil about it. From that point of view, it's clear that the ghosts of his family's egalitarian origins, Spencer seems to be helping him to clear that away. So he's very grateful to Spencer. Spencer, in a sense, puts ghosts to flight.
By 1872, Carnegie had worked 2 years beyond what he said he would in his letter to himself. What he saw in England that summer would make him work 30 years more. For centuries, craftsmen had been able to purify small batches of iron, which is brittle, into steel, which can be shaped. Now, industrialist Henry Bessemer's pear-shaped furnace could convert large batches of iron into steel. Carnegie saw British iron mills expanding as steel plants. He knew the age of iron was over. He committed his own money and borrowed heavily for a new steel plant at Braddock, near Pittsburgh, and began to haul Bessemer converters to the site. He was looking forward to the opening of his huge new plant at Braddock, looking forward to the age of steel. On August 22nd, 1875, Carnegie witnessed the greatest fireworks display modern industry could produce. Blasts of air burned out impurities in his molten iron, and a silver-white liquid, steel, was poured into waiting molds that would form ingots that would be rolled into rails. With calculated flattery, Carnegie named his plant the Edgar Thomson Works for the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was known as E.T. His first order was 2,000 steel rails for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Carnegie shocked a meeting of mill owners who divided the rail market among them by demanding a share equal to the largest.
Carnegie arrives and announces that he's bought stock in all their companies, and he's read their reports, and he sees, as he goes around the table pointing at various people, that this president makes $50,000 a year and has an $80,000 a year expense account, and so on, whereas his president makes $5,000 a year and has no expense account. I know my costs, he says, and I know yours. And if you don't give me the share I want, in effect, he says, I'll run you all out of business because you can't compete with me.
Carnegie knew his plant was efficient and his approach unique. His competition would eye profits. He would eye costs. And he developed a system to track them day by day, penny by penny. His dictum at at the Edgar Thomson Works was watch the costs and the profits take care of themselves. He would move steel in big volumes like the railroads, run his furnaces fast and full. Data on costs and volume were wired to Carnegie in New York. From there, he badgered his managers and tried to inspire a spirit of competition among his workers. It seemed to work.
All you had to do was pit one furnace against another. For the prize of being the best producer of that week, you got to post a steel broom at the top of your smokestack. And the men actually got into the spirit. It was part of the competitive spirit of America. And when one plant would triumphantly say, "We broke all records this week," Carnegie's response was, "What about next week?"
The new record raised next week's quota. If a manager or work crew fell behind, they would be fired. Competition was a driving force, but it drove the workers 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. The only holiday they got was the 4th of July. The efficiency of the plant, so important to Carnegie, reduced workers to unskilled tenders of machines, easily replaced, often dehumanized. Those who had dominated the metal business before the age of steel found it especially hard. They were craftsmen who were used to controlling the process of making wrought iron, literally cooking it in small batches.
And it's an art, not a science. And it was an art practiced by these people called puddlers, who pushed it and stirred it and literally spat upon it and judged it by its color and the color of the flames that shot out of it to announce when this cooking was done. With the shift from puddling to the Bessemer process comes also a shift in control of the workplace. And this, of course, the union was most reluctant to see happen, and Carnegie and the other managers were most anxious to see happen.
From the moment ET opened, workers and their unions battled Carnegie for livable wages and control of the shop floor. A decisive battle would come in a matter of years. But the days of the puddler, of all creative labor in a mill, were numbered. At ET, Carnegie introduced a scale of production that was daunting and irreversible. As the Industrial Revolution had claimed the jobs of handloom weavers like his father, it would now claim skilled craftsmen like the puddlers. The change from the age of iron to the age of steel had human costs, but not for Carnegie. He was able to foresee the revolution and to harness it. Carnegie's brash assault on the world of steel was a success from the start. He was mass-producing steel, cheap steel that fueled the growth of a nation. Three years after ET opened, Carnegie got the contract to supply the structural steel for the Brooklyn Bridge. A minister at the dedication remarked on the metal that built the bridge. Steel, he declared, is the chiefest of modern instruments, the kingliest instrument of peoples for subduing the earth. The industry Carnegie was beginning to dominate had come to symbolize America's technological development and national greatness. Carnegie was so proud of his new plant, he begged his English mentor Herbert Spencer to come to Pittsburgh to see how a new industrial order had evolved.
Carnegie believed he was playing out Spencer's concept of progress toward utopia. And he finally succeeds in getting Spencer to come to visit Pittsburgh, and Spencer saw what Carnegie thought was the industrial utopia as the kind of nightmare of late 19th century industrialism. Spencer said 6 months' residence in Pittsburgh would be justification for suicide.
With E.T. a success, Carnegie bought another mill across the river at Homestead. It was a bargain, but it would cost him dearly. Homestead's new open hearth furnaces made it the steel mill of the future. Novelist Hamlin Garland would write of a roar as of 100 lions, a thunder as of cannons, burst of spluttering flakes of fire. He described fierce ovens giving off a glare of heat and horrible stenches of gases. Everywhere, the deafening hiss of escaping steam. I saw men prodding in the deep soaking pits where ingots glowed in white-hot chambers. I saw other men in the hot yellow glare from the furnaces. It was a place into which men went like men going into war for the sake of wives and children, urged on by necessity. A man works in peril of his life for 14 cents an hour. Upon such toil rests the splendor of American civilization. The town itself was foul. Garland wrote of great sheds out of which grim smokestacks rose with a desolate effect, like the black stumps of a burned forest of great trees. The New York Weekly Tribune noted Homestead's lack of sewers and drainage. There are deep gutters on both sides of every street, but whenever it rains, the gutters fill up with water which stagnates and becomes covered with green, slimy scum, which sends up odors sickening to the extreme. This was home to thousands. The English speakers with the skilled jobs lived on the hill. They could look down on those they called the hunkies, the Slavs and Hungarians who did the dirty work and lived in the cluttered alleys by the tracks behind the mill. But, like war, the mill forged a brotherhood. The mill was their life, and it would be their children's lives. There is a fascination about the mill, a sociologist wrote, against which even unwilling mothers find themselves helpless to contend. Something else made Homestead unique. Workers ran the town, and through their unions they helped run the mill. The strikes which had forced the former owners to sell to Carnegie on the cheap would now be his problem.